I just thought it'd be useful just to give a little bit of context to why we're here, and that obviously is now that the local nature recovery strategy is a legal requirement. And there's a couple of things, obviously, that as legally it's required to have, which is very simply, you know, some biodiversity priorities and a local habitat map. But the aspiration is really huge. It's all about, you know, recovering nature across England like it's never done before. And by doing that, it's about, you know, identifying opportunity areas, and it's really underpinned by the current biodiversity, the mandatory biodiversity net gain, and the strengthened NERC Act. So this could be really quite aspirational and achieve lots of great things. But the guidance really only very basically touches briefly on, you know, the need for stakeholder involvement and this idea of this wider value of nature, which is around nature-based solutions. And I just really wanted to focus very much on the last 2 points. And I think the event today is very much, you know, when we were trying to work it out, we were trying to think about what's really important about the delivery of these strategies. And between us all, we were very keen to focus on that community involvement, because ultimately, you know, if you want to get anything delivered, really it's the buy-in that's so important, and that's very much top down and also bottom up. So that's why we've created this event today, and why it's great to have the presentations and our great speakers talking later. And I just really wanted to just throw up this mad person, as you see in front of you on this slide, who just my small take on this process from quite a slightly out of the box approach, which is really the importance of communication. You know, we're not just talking about data, we are talking about communication, and we're talking about people. So how are we communicating the local nature recovery strategy? You know, we need buy-in and we need people to act on it. So we need to communicate well and we need to communicate widely. If we are creating maps of data, who are we talking to? You know, we're actually, when I was walking around London with a SINC, the acronym being, you know, and the nature reserves in London are sites of importance for nature conservation, so SINC. So that's the joke, and I had some wonderful conversations with people along my way, you know, in nature reserves like this one at Canby Street, but I also went on the tube with my SINC, I went on the bus with my SINC, I went all over the place. And the point being is that no one knows anything about what we're doing here, no one. It's all, people don't even know what a SINC is. You know, the nature reserves are like completely bizarre ideas for the centre of London, you know, but yet we know how important and how nature rich London is. So I think there's a massive communication thing that we need to do. So yeah, and if we get it right, conversely, if we communicate well and we communicate with the artistic ways, and, you know, thinking about different types of people, then we have an opportunity to really spread you know, the ideas of a nature recovered to a very, very broad spectrum of people. So just the next slide, please, Caitlin. So just as sort of a part of this process then, in Newham, I've been working with the local community as I'm a trustee of a garden in the north. And I think it's very interesting how actually perhaps there's a new ecological network we need to start mapping as well, alongside the nature, that, you know, the nature bit, but our nature, and that actually it's important really to recognise how much the community has to play in all this, and really how are we understanding them, and how is that relationship with nature and the habitats we're going to be creating, and how it's going to be delivered and then maintained for 30 years or more. So it's a bit radical, but I really feel that actually to really to enable the local nature recovery strategies ultimately to be resilient and long lasting, we really need to think about how we are connected to that space and place. And that's my little little random idea for the presentation. So that's for me, and I look forward to some more questions as we work through the presentations today.
Thank you, Rosie. That was really inspiring. I think a really great introduction to what our event is today. So if you'd like to stay around for the discussion at the end, I'm sure people can ask you questions then. So shall we move on to Tom, please? Do you like to share your screen?
Yeah, of course. Okay, hopefully you can see that.
That's great.
So thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to be here. My name's Tom Butterworth. I'm a director in ARUP. I lead our nature work. And I'm going to start at the other end of the sort of telescope. I'm going to start by talking about some of the global ambitions and strategies that have led us to needing nature recovery strategies, and then how they've evolved. So I'm going to do a sort of very brief and very potted history in quarter of an hour of biodiversity action plans, biodiversity opportunity areas, and biodiversity strategies, just to really touch on where this is coming from, to hopefully point some useful things in terms of where we can go with our local nature recovery strategies, and some of the pieces that we can learn, some of the lessons we can learn from the past, some of the things that are different from our historical attempts at biodiversity and nature strategies. And many of you may well be well aware of some of this context. This is back in 1992, the Convention on Biological Diversity was set up. The Earth Summit held in Rio we had 190 governments sign up to some commitments. This is where the climate COP came from, as well as a COP on stopping deserts growing, and the Biodiversity COP. So that's a convention of parties, so the coming together of all of the countries to agree how we address loss of biodiversity. And the Convention on Biological Diversity committed to driving forward preservation of biological diversity, sustainable use of that diversity, and fair and equitable sharing, which is really critical, and is actually something that last point has come out more and more strongly over the years, and is right front and center now, as we'll see in a moment. Now, this was way back in 1992. It was so talked about. This was actually on children's TV at the time. They were talking about this convention. So I'm not sure that would be the case now with the COPs and so on now. I'm gonna jump forward a little bit, to about 2009, and I've got a timeline that I'm going to use to talk through the timings of this. This is my timeline. So this is back in 2009, where we were breaching 3 of our planetary boundaries. So if you're not aware, this is some work from the Stockholm Resilience Centre, where they've identified boundaries for working on sustainably, living sustainably within our Earth. And back in 2009, we recognised we were breaching 3 of those. So back in those heady days, we produced a strategy off the back of the 1992 convention. We produced a whole load of strategies and plans to look after nature. And in England, we produced one called Working with the Grain of Nature. And this was came out in 2002, as I've said, and it was a vision for the country. And it led to the development, or it was building off the back of the development of something we called HAPs and SAPs, Habitat Action Plans and Species Action Plans. This is where these biodiversity action plans came from, and you can still find a lot of them on websites. We had a whole load of companies developing biodiversity action plans. We had one for the country, and every biodiversity action plan, every county had its own biodiversity action plan and HAP and SAPs. There were 391 particular action plans for species and 45 for the habitats, and those were all translated into geographically specific county level biodiversity plans with targets that were signed up to for the habitat expansion by the Secretary of State in DEFRA for each habitat, say let's chalk grassland, and they were then distributed out to each county. So I was working in Oxfordshire at the time, coordinating conservation work there, and then we had a specific target on chalk grassland, on woodland, and so on, that we were trying to deliver through agri-environment schemes and so on. and grant funding. Now, off the back of that, we produced a whole load of maps, and this is a map for the southeast of England that was produced. This is a map of biodiversity opportunity areas. It looks a bit splodgy, but that's because of my GIS skills at the time rather than anything else. It was actually mapped down to the field boundary based on geology and soils and floodplains, with a ton of consultation. We had an awful lot of consultation meetings across the whole of the southeast with loads of with all the relevant partners, but also loads of local actors as well, local people delivering gains on the ground. And you can see the example here from Sussex. And each of these areas, each individual parcel of land that may be following the chalk along the Chilterns or following the floodplain through Oxford, had a specific target area statement saying what habitats it was meant to be delivering, what habitats were there at the moment, how they can connect them up and join them up and make them better. The idea was that these habitat action plans and biodiversity action plans could be targeted into these areas, and we can get money from agri-environment schemes, grant funding, development planning, and so on, all delivering into these areas. Then 2010 or thereabouts, this was this, along with we actually had regional maps in every region. We had 9 regions, and every region had its own map. And Professor Sir John Lawton, I'm sure you're well aware of his work, did this incredible piece of work called Making Space for Nature. And this was a review of the ecological network across England, and it said that we should be making them bigger, better, more enjoined. What's important here is what I feel is often forgotten, is that there's a priority order here, and the first thing is improving the quality of the existing sites, the better bit, then increasing their size, and then joining them up. And that's because we need to look after what we've already got first before we start building out. And the evidence is that looking after the existing sites is going to have the biggest impact ecologically, and connecting up will come sort of down that list. It's third on this list. Now this takes us into 2010, where we had a whole set of targets set out internationally again. So this is a follow-on from the previous ambitions in '92. I said it was a potted history. We've jumped quite forward. We had an International Year of Biodiversity in 2010, and actually the UN then said that 2011 to 2020 was the International Decade for Biodiversity. I don't know if anybody noticed that. It sort of slipped by, didn't it? We had a whole set of targets here, including a target to, and I have to read this, now, by 2020, the rate of loss of all natural habitats, including forests, is at least halved, and where feasible, brought close to zero. Now, that is quite a difficult target to interpret, let alone deliver. And within Europe, slowing the rate of loss by half wasn't deemed acceptable, and the European Union came up with a strategy that was much stronger than that and said we're gonna get to no net loss of habitats by 2020. Target 11, we'll come back to this one later, but target 11 here says that 17% of the terrestrial and inland water and 10% of our coastal and marine areas are protected. Some of you will know that we've got a bigger target now for that. But this was 2010. This is when we thought we could reverse the loss of biodiversity by 2020. And off the back of that, all the countries got busy again, produced fantastic strategies. And this was our strategy in 2020, where the Minister and actually Prime Minister, I think there's a forward, if I remember rightly, in this about the importance of this ambition. And we've got some targets to support our wildlife. 90% of our priority habitats, making them less fragmented, and the species target, which is a little bit vague. Overall improvement in the status of our wildlife. Well, there we go. I mean, yeah, there we go. Anyway, by 2015, so 5 years on from this, my timescale had moved on. We've now breaching 4 of our planetary boundaries. And I was doing some work to try and find examples of where we'd got to by 2015. And I came across a presentation and I thought, oh, this looks interesting. And then I realized it was my presentation, which is a little bit of a surprise. But I've just nicked some slides from my own presentation back in 2015. So I was working in Natural England looking after Biodiversity 2020. And at the time, we had 62% of our priority habitats into favourable or recovering condition, mostly recovering. And we'd created, or we'd started the creation of about 67,000 hectares of new priority habitat. So way off our targets, but given that we had another 5 years, we were optimistic that we could move this in the right direction. And there were a number of things that happened in the second half of that decade that meant that this all went to pot, but the ambition was there. And at the time we were talking about integrated landscape scale delivery, looking at the priority habitats, the economic benefits, the species conservation benefits, and educational access and so on. We were working in partnership with farmers, landowners, with the Environment Agency, Natural England, to try and look at carbon storage and bring in new sources of funding. But sadly, we didn't deliver. We weren't successful. We failed to deliver on all of these targets that we'd set out. And in 2018, the government set out a new set of strategy, the 25-year plan for the environment, which thriving plants and wildlife, slightly simplifying the language perhaps, but the ambition clearly there. Very shortly after this, so this is 2018, very shortly after this, we had the Descriptor review that flagged that we are losing biodiversity faster than in any time in human history, and that half our global GDP is directly dependent on nature. And of course, a couple of years ago, in the most recent biodiversity COP, we had a nature positive ambition and a whole set of new targets. And this time we've got a biodiversity, this first target, biodiversity inclusive in spatial planning with a near zero loss, and 30% of the land protected, land and seas protected. So if anything, we're getting better at writing our targets, and we've got much clearer targets that are easier to measure against. Are we getting better at delivering them? Well, no, not yet. There's a couple of other points I just want to bring out quickly here that I'll come back to in a moment, but target 15, this point that mentions businesses, is really important, I think. We'll come back to that in a moment. But this is 2022. This was published with the ambition to restore nature by 2030. Some of these targets are 2050, some are by 2030. And if we go back to my time frame, we're now breaching 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the planetary boundaries. So this, for me, this makes nature recovery strategies more important than ever. And I've nicked a picture from the Wildlife Trust, who I think do some really good stuff on nature recovery networks. As we've already heard, these nature recovery networks need to be a local map, need to be written statements on biodiversity priorities. That's, in some respects, that's not anything new. We've had maps before, we've had written statements before. What's really important here is these points that the Wildlife Trust have flagged, this collective responsibility, this evidence base, the fact that they're statutory. This is the first time that these have been a legal requirement. That Biodiversity 2020 was a strategy, not even a policy, it was a strategy, so several steps down from legislation. That these are everywhere across the country is really important. We had an ambition between the habitat action plans and what we've got now. We've had an ambition for nature recovery plans, and they weren't covering the whole of the country. And we've got a real importance about engaging people locally to deliver and identify and deliver these plans and strategies, and that's really critical. So I believe that we can build on all of this work that's gone before. I think it's critical that we do. It's still available. Go and grab it, have a look at it, chuck the stuff out you don't like, use the stuff you do like, because let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's take all of that good stuff and then call it our own and reinvent it based on all of the stuff we've already done. Makes it much easier. And that is the path to a nature positive outcome. The three things that I take away from all of this that I put in my thing, optimistic. The three things that I'm really optimistic here is that we've got a much wider partnership to deliver these nature recovery strategies than we ever had before. We've got much wider engagement than we ever had before. We've got businesses. I said I'd come back to that target 15 in that global ambition. We've got businesses engaging with nature in ways that we've never seen before. The recognition that those businesses within those businesses that nature is critical for their functioning, and that they need to look after the nature in and around where they're working is coming through, and it's coming through not just in terms of goodwill but also financially. I think this is the time we need to change this. This is the time we need to shift towards a nature positive outcome and start moving some of those global planetary boundaries back into something that's sustainable. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was very inspiring and really brilliant overview. We have time for sort of maybe 1 or 2 questions. If anyone would like to raise your hand or type in the chat. Oh, there was one in the chat already. Might have sort of touched upon it now already. But this is from Matthew Frith. Matthew, do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Yeah, thank you, Caitlin. It's really just a kind of statement for both Tom and Rosie, and it comes from my kind of cynical activity in this over the last 30 years. And Tom put it very well. We've done a lot of work on this since 1992, and I'm rather afraid, from my experience so far, that LNRSs are kind of getting us to do stuff that we've done before in ever more detail. You made almost a throwaway comment, Tom, which I thought was very telling, and which I'm picking up, is this desire to get ever more data. Clearly there are parts of the country where there isn't so much data which is usable, and it's not held in all one place, but there are parts of the country where that data is usable, it is in one place, and it can be used. And I just get worried that we get diverted down those kind of rabbit holes of saying, well, you haven't got enough information to really make decisions. I think we have. We know exactly where we need to do these things. We know exactly how to do these things. It's just that there are significant constraints in terms of time, capacity, skills, money, and politics that enable us to achieve the visions. But we need to remain optimistic. So I think I go back to your final comment, Tom, which I totally support, is pick up from the best that's been done before. Don't reinvent the wheel. And even on Rosie's point, there was that stuff happening in London in the 1980s and 90s. It's just that we got better mechanisms of keeping in touch that we didn't have in the past. So let's use those.
Yeah, completely agree, Matthew. I mean, you and I were working together at this time as well, but when I was doing the biodiversity opportunity areas in the southeast, my boss said, look, we've done this all before. Why are you doing this again? So, nothing's new. The point is that we have all, previously it was all bits of paper that someone had written and a report that was sitting in a drawer. We have all of this as GIS data, that all the record centres across the southeast hold. We have, that information that we had on each of those biodiversity opportunity areas. It's there. I downloaded it the other day, so it's still available. So yeah, absolutely. Let's take all of that and run with it, and not worry about getting the perfect data. Completely agree with you, Matthew, and nice to see you.
And you, thank you.
Thank you. I think we have a question from Geoff as well.
Tom, many thanks. And just following on from Matthew, a quick sort of technical question, really, because I think it affects the way in which I will go on and give my presentation. I mean, to what extent are LNRS statutory? And I hadn't really picked up on this. What sort of planning bite will they have?
Who would like to answer that? I can answer if you like. There's a requirement. So there's a requirement within the Environment Act for every local area, and it's mostly local authorities, but it does vary. There's a map on the DEFRA website to produce a local nature recovery strategy, and that strategy has to have those 2 elements that Rosie and I have both pointed to: a map and a statement of the biodiversity priorities. Beyond that, I think it's pretty weak, in my view. However, we have got a few other pieces that play into this. We've got biodiversity net gain. We can absolutely help to shape where some of that off-site work. I know that's got to be the last resort in our mitigation hierarchy, but that off-site work can be targeted. We've got agri-environment schemes we can target into the right places. We've got grant funding, whether it be Heritage Lottery Fund or other funding that we can target into the right places. And we've got a trickle, which I hope will become a flood, of funding from corporates that we can target into the right places. And if we do that, then whether the actual maps are statutory or not is less important than whether they're agreed. And what's critical is that we all agree and drive forward the action in a coordinated way.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's great. Useful.
Can I just add a little bit on that as well, in that and I think it's really critical that those maps are readable by normal people, you know, in the sense that, like, not everyone is data focused. I like looking at maps, and a lot of you probably do as well, but doesn't mean that everyone else does. I think those maps and how they're visualized are critical in terms of how shareable they are. So if we really use that our tech to our best advantage, then we would make a map that was mega shareable by everybody, you know, anybody that who likes a map, who wants to be inspired. Yes, it has to be realistic. Yes, it has to be achievable, but it absolutely has to be shareable. Otherwise, it's just going to collect dust again. And I think the major issue that we've had always is that we're basically siloed. You know, we all do basically work in our little bubbles, and we don't realize that other people are in their own bubbles. And the only way really to ensure that everybody, like, I would love to go to a project or community or a planning meeting and have someone share me back the map that I know, because then we are in a position where we've got a chance for everyone to be supportive and also actually inspired to deliver it. I think there's a real risk that no one will see it and no one will share it, and then no one will know it exists, and that's actually the problem I think we've had in the past.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. Yeah, I'm sure we can get into more discussion on this later on, but we'll move on to Geoff now for the sake of time. There we go. I've just shared the screen.
Caitlin, thanks. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Geoff Griffiths, actually retired from the University of Reading, but from Geography and Environmental Science, but stayed on as a visiting professor in the School of Agriculture, but also work with my friend and colleague Stephen Warnock in a small consultancy group called Landscape Matters. The next one. Okay, and it's I mean, both Rosie and Tom provided very good introductions to what I'm going to say over the next 10 minutes or so, in the sense that Rosie talked about this top-down, bottom-up. Tom gave a brilliant exposition of a kind of top-down potted history of the last 20 years or so, finishing with local nature recovery strategies. And I'm hoping to work from the bottom up and meet local nature recovery strategies. So you'll see here that we're talking now not about the global context, but about a very, very small part of West Oxfordshire. 3 parishes sitting between Chipping Norton and Witney. Some of you will, I'm sure, will know this part of the world. Many of you will have been through Charlbury on the train. So the really key question in my mind is the extent to which a parish-based approach can actually contribute towards the county level local nature recovery strategy, how we incorporate that parish-based approach into that strategy, and what is the two-way traffic between LNRS and parish-based work. And we're already well protected, if you like. This is an AOM, not an AOMB. It's the Cotswold Natural Landscape now. We have a local farm cluster, a network of protected sites, you know, CTAs, conservation target areas, etc., etc. You know, the question then is what can parishes, mostly volunteers, contribute to that process, and how can we scale this up to county level and beyond? Sorry, next one. Okay, next one, Caitlin, are we? I'm not. Okay, so no, too far. One back, sorry, my fault. So why the parish? Why parish level? Well, it's a useful administrative unit of governance. People tend to identify with their local parish and their local landscape. Volunteers, here you can see people working on the Millfield. It's a meadowland restoration project. I mean, local knowledge, and Tom touched on this, incredibly important, that there are people in the parish who know an awful lot about it. I mean, there is some sense in which parish clusters form a landscape scale. Of course, parishes are administrative. They don't necessarily coincide with landscape as we understand it. But once you get beyond 3, 4, 5 parishes, you're beginning to encompass a landscape scale of ecology. An important thing is that parishes own land. I mean, I worked out from a blog by Guy Shrubsole recently that something like, excluding urban areas, something like 2.5% of the land area of England is owned by parishes, parish councils. So, and that's land where volunteers and parish conservation or nature recovery projects can have direct influence. What we've got to do, of course, is to scale up. From 3 parishes here to something like 10,500 parishes across the country, which is going to be again going to be challenging. Next one. So there is a process. We've been helped enormously by the Oxfordshire Treescapes project set up by Jamie Hartzell and Victoria McNamara. And they set out, and others, they set out a process, and there's quite a lot of information on the web about parish nature conservation planning. We set up a core group, which is a working group of the Town Council, the London Nature Group. We are looking at some baseline mapping, so back to maps, as Rosie was talking about. I'm not sure that they're always as shareable as they should be, but I'm sure that's something that we need to work on. And then developing this framework, putting that out to consultation, and then coming up with a plan is the way in which we're hoping to move forward. Although we recognise that this is probably a work of decades rather than years. And the next, please. So what do we want to achieve? It's local site. So, you know, the example of the Millfield that I've just shown you, and landscape scale, including water quality, although I'm not really going to talk about that today. And we've taken on board this idea of the 30 by 30 biodiversity, conventional biodiversity action. 30% of the land area of the parish and cluster in favourable condition for wildlife by 2030. We want to contribute to the county level LNRS and to the local plan, which has just been reviewed by Waddock, West Oxfordshire District Council. One of the things that you notice, and Tom referred to this right at the end of his talk, is that if you look at the DEFRA Local Nature Recovery Strategy website, you'll see local groups, communities, parishes writ large there. Clearly, some thought has gone into the contribution that they can make, and it's going to be interesting to see how that actually happens. I mean, a supplement to the neighbourhood plan, which was a lot of work locally and included some elements of the natural environment. And last but not least, informing, engaging and encouraging residents and landowners about nature recovery. There's a huge engagement, education job to be done here as well. And Caitlin, next one, please. So just very quickly on the parish, I don't want to dwell on this. Typical Cotswold landscape of arable mixed farming. I mean, a very, very important point is, and I'll come back to that, is it's dominated by large estates. Ditchley, some of you will know, is politically important. Cornbury, Wilcott, Blenheim. And we've got this River Evenlode blue-green corridor that runs through the 3 parishes, which is a dominant landscape type within the region. Quite small parishes, probably, I think, less than the medium size of a parish across England. With arable about 60-odd%, woodland about 8%, pasture 20%, built up about 8%. So nothing very exceptional, nothing very exciting about these three parishes, and very typical sort of Cotswold landscape. And on to the next, please. But one of the things that we need to be very aware of in thinking of habitat expansion and linking and corridors and tree planting and so on is the character of the landscape. And my friend and colleague Stephen Warnock recently updated the Oxfordshire Landscape Character Assessment, and I make a plea here to remember the cultural landscape, to think in terms of those very, very sharp differences between the ancient landscapes along the River Evenlode, which have some resemblance to the ancient Wychwood Forest, compared to the much more modern planned landscapes of estate farmlands and estate woodlands. And I think it's really important to remember to bring that landscape character and cultural pattern into our planning, which so often gets forgotten. And Caitlin, next one, please. So lots of mapping. I'm fortunate in that I'm familiar with QGIS, Quantum GIS, but we also use the Land app, which has been a huge help at local level. It's so easy to use, and it does produce shareable maps within our group. So that's been extremely important. And there you can see on the left the map of semi-natural habitats dominated by mixed woodland, broadleaf woodland, permanent grassland and mixed scrub. Surprising amount of work, combination of PHI, Priority Habitat Inventory, Natural England, TVERC, Thames Valley Environmental Record Centre, and some photo interpretation by me of Google Earth and Bing aerial imagery. Also quite useful to have had some help from Alison Smith of the Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery at Oxford University. She has access to some new Google mapping on hedgerows, which of course is available at a time when CEH are also producing a new hedgerow map of England, which I haven't yet had a chance to look at. But we can begin to map the 72 kilometres of hedges and 46 kilometres of overgrown hedges, and the 175 hedgerow trees. So these are our natural assets, if you like, and of course that we're mapping this at a level of detail that perhaps wasn't possible or isn't possible at the much bigger landscape scale of the character area. Tom showed us an example of Sussex. I have a feeling that actually some of this local detail is really quite important, that we're going to be able to, some of our wins are going to be with small areas of habitat that would otherwise be forgotten. Okay, and moving on, Caitlin, thanks. So very important point that, and again, we've already heard a little bit about this. Tom mentioned protected areas, CTAs, nature recovery networks, SSSIs, and so on and so forth. Huge area of the parish is already covered by these kind of designations. And also ecosystem services, again, something we've already mentioned, and looking at biodiversity values and carbon in tons per hectare. I mean, we can map these things as Matthew has mentioned. We're good at this. We have lots of data. It's this question of how we put it all together and come up with something that's useful in a practical way. Very limited species data. So some data from TVERC on notable and rare species, but we're going to have to rely on local surveys, I think, for all sorts of additional species data, which is going to be time consuming, I guess. And the next. So we have begun to think about indicative sites, and these are meant for illustration only, really. It's an opportunistic approach based partly on the mapping that we've done and our local knowledge. So in red there, you can see these so-called restoration sites, a woodland corridor linking the woodlands of ancient woodland of Wychwood to the southwest, with some of the more modern woodlands of Cornbury and Ditchley to the northeast. Some areas of limestone grassland that could be restored. These are nothing more than indicative sites, projects that could be worked on, but obviously only with the consent and collaboration of landowners. And to some extent, this indicative mapping has been informed by the science, which of course goes back to John Lawton's Making Space for Nature. And you can see here some mapping by TVERC, the Thames Valley Environmental Record Centre, that shows some of these ideas about linking and better and more joined and so on that we can take on board. Okay, next one. So consultation, this was mentioned. We need at some point to translate what has been referred to as a framework, because it's part of a process, into a plan. So something that is actually a concrete plan that can be, with projects and sites that can be implemented on the ground. Interestingly, working with the town council, two of the members of the Landscape Nature Group, three of the members of the Landscape Nature Group are elected town councillors, and they were very keen to ensure that approval from town council was only given if we were willing to change the name of the original idea of a plan into a framework that would then go out to consultation. And we've started to do that last summer at the Riverside Festival. Some of you who may have been, it's a music festival, and we had a river tent with the Evenlode Catchment Partnership, and we persuaded people, unwitting members of the public, to draw comments on a Google on a open source map, and we had a consultation for the community orchard in Finstock, for example. So we've done a number of events, and we're having a consultation launch at the Wigwell Nature Reserve on the 15th of June. So a date for everybody's diaries. We'd love to see people there. But the consultation is going to be very important, and we're hoping that will enable us to move from this framework into something tangible, into a plan. And the next one, Caitlin. So really coming to an end. I mean, there are a number of limitations. We're working with, albeit enthusiastic, but often non-experts. This is inevitable. We're all volunteers at parish level. Limited resources and data. Funding from Charlbury Town Council, gratefully received, but of course that doesn't go far. Non-cooperation of landowners. We're talking to landowners, but we don't always get the buy-in that we'd like. This rapidly changing policy environment. In particular, it's a key question about how what we do will integrate with the county scale LNRS. A somewhat uncertain financial landscape. ELMS, BNG, carbon credits. I mean, there's been quite a lot of farmer unhappiness over the last few weeks, both in North Wales at Llandudno and in Westminster, about the post-Brexit settlement. And then, so this, finally, do parishes have a role? In how does all of this scale up to the whole of West Oxford, to the whole of the county? Can it be possibly is it really achievable for every parish in the county to do the kind of mapping and work that we've done, and then feed that through into the local nature recovery strategy? And if so, what are county going to do with it? Will it be too much data? Will it be interesting? Is it just replicating work that has already been done? And I think the answer to that is that is the localism bit of this. It's this extraordinary depth and breadth of knowledge that people have about their local parish, and somehow we have to find a way to bring that into this process. Final slide, Caitlin, I think. Yep. Okay, just to say thank you to, well, for all of you for listening, to Chalbury Town Council, Sustainable Chalbury, and others, and particularly the Land App and the QGIS project for providing some of the mapping tools, not forgetting the members of the London Nature Group who have been enormously enthusiastic volunteers on this journey. Thanks all very much.
It was wonderful. Thank you, Geoff.
Thanks, Caitlin.
I really, really love the idea of doing a consultation where, you know, you go to a local festival. That's really cool.
Yes, and good fun.
Yeah.
Quite often.
Yeah. I think for the sake of time, maybe if we have any questions now, you can pop them in the chat and we'll come back to them at the end. Otherwise, we'll move straight on to Gideon. So I'll just open your slide. Well, I suppose one person can ask a question whilst I'm trying to share the screen.
Hi, Caitlin. Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I am part of a community group, volunteer community group called the Wildlife Gardeners of Haggerston. We've been working mostly, inevitably, during the time of the BAP, but from what the really interesting talks have said before, I'm not sure how the local nature recovery plans will be that different practically on the ground. We've been working in London, in Hackney, where the landscapes are much smaller, where we can work. So that's a very big difference, but it does affect lots of people. I'm just going to start rather than explain, and hopefully everything will become clearer. I think that it is possible to improve biodiversity from the bottom up. People do know the area, as has been said before with Geoff and Tom. We have local knowledge, but the work, the improvements are very vulnerable to changes. We've used different techniques to make improvements and to defend these improvements. I'm just going to race through these. Guerrilla planting, that's how we started. Then defensive planting, getting agreements from the landowners when we realised that we needed that, because everything was so vulnerable. Publicity and awards, we didn't want to do that. The awards were not that important, but they were useful as defence against losses of the work. Funding was also important. It was crucial, but also it was a way of defending, because people don't want to waste their money, so they could be brought in to give help. We also try and changing local policy and changing designation of the land. Next, please. I'm going to talk about two different areas. One is private land. It's an area around and within a basin along the Regent's Canal, very, very built up. And the other is on Hackney Marshes. It's the Old Lee, which is maybe the most natural. It's not natural at all, but it's the most natural area in Hackney. Next, please. Just to put what we've been doing in context, Hackney's had no biodiversity officer since 2012, but that hasn't stopped Hackney from doing great work with street tree planting and tree planting in general. So there was plentiful resource to fulfill the Mayor's pledge to increase tree cover. It didn't need a biodiversity officer. Just going to the neighbouring borough, there's City Road Basin, where there was, in comparison to the vision for lots more trees, especially on streets, there was no vision to improve a very large water body. There was so much, anyone who knows this area along City Road, huge skyscrapers have gone up, luxury flats. How any funding wasn't diverted, a tiny fraction, a couple of kitchens worth from some of these luxury flats could have made City Road Basin amazing. That didn't happen. But in general, biodiversity action plans were not followed through, but residents were able to fill this vacuum. Next, please. So this one example, Kingsland Basin, there were ecological enhancements that were conditioned in, but these were largely unfulfilled. These range from landscape planting, marginal planting, and bird boxes. And there was no aftercare as well. There was no management of the landscape, at least initially. Next, please. So we moved in and to the area, and we had a tip-off from a neighbour who told us what was supposed to be in the area. And so we started two approaches. One was direct, just working, planting aquatic plants, marginal plants, cleaning the area, but also trying to work out why nothing was in place. Next, please. So we went through the council and freedom of information to try and find out what was going on. And the planting did have an effect that worked well. Just so right at the back, next slide, it'll probably become a little bit clear. What we found was within the different organisations, whether it was the council or the owners of the land, the housing association, if we could find someone who cared, who had a little bit of power, then we could affect change. So there was a trespass of the land, a new development which is off screen, trespassed, and they took some of the land, in fact some of the water, and that could get monetized, and a manager at the housing association was able to get some funds from the trespasser, and that paid for some floating islands, 200 meters squared, almost surrounding the entire basin, and that changed the effect, changed the basin from being a stark, hard-edged area into something much more natural. So that was 5 years that took of different efforts, and then I'm joking when I say it, but the universe provided, and the funding arrived, and this manager was as good as his word and delivered. Next, please. So although the planning conditions stipulated native species and biodiverse planting, what we got was car park style planting. And then you can see, so that's on the left, and on the right, once we had the floating islands in with native species, you can also see that we planted ivy along the wall on the right-hand side and other planting. And this was all residents. There was the council, the housing association, no one else was involved. And what there was a vacuum. No biodiversity officer, no grounds maintenance, or very little. Next, please. And by lockdown, this is what had arrived. We put in reeds and reed mace into a marshy area, and suddenly I thought we've given ourselves a huge management problem because they were taking over what was a fairly diverse area. But luckily swans arrived and trashed that and took all of the vegetation out and built their nest. And people during lockdown were queuing up to watch what was going on as the swans hatched. And there was, we had to put Harris fencing up to protect everything. Next, please. So if you could just play these, yes. So we had the full life cycle of pike. We had to get no fishing signs up, otherwise these were regularly hauled out of the water, photographed, and then thrown back in. That took quite a long time. And the kingfisher, this is slowed down a little bit. And then the reed warbler, I can't hear that. Maybe it's not playing the sound. That's okay, but it was amazing. In this small area, a reed warbler had found its way. And can I just mention, so with the pike in the top left-hand side, there's a tiny pike, a pikelet. So we had the full life cycle of the top predator in the basin, which was really good. So a lot of this was protecting what was there or what arrived. Next, please. We depaved, we've got some funding for depaving. A lot of the scheme was just hard standing. The final picture on the right was taken this week. We've got cladding scaffolding up, so that's why it's a little bit odd, that final photo. Next, please. And you can see the amenity value from where it begins through to the end, or how it was a couple of years ago. Next, please. And what we found was we needed protection from what was going on. There were continual setbacks the whole time. Maybe 50% of what we put in and planted survived, and we thought that was pretty good. So we were very happy to be in the different probity parts of the Evening Standard and the Times, because it showed that people were happy with nature in the city. We were happy to get Green Flag Awards because that gave us some sort of visibility and protection. When the National Park, London National Park City arrived, that felt like almost like a union of like-minded people and groups. We won an award in Europe, and during the presentation, I said that the placard that we got felt like a shield that could protect us from the assaults on the vegetation that we'd been planting in. And finally, we'll try and get local politicians in. This is the ex-mayor opening the copse that we'd planted. Next, please. And then we also, we kind of got official, at least we had it in an email, agreement from the landowner for what we had been doing, which was great. Next, please. And then we moved on. This isn't all completely chronological, but it makes it's easier to explain it. Then we moved further out onto the Regent's Canal itself, and we planted up scrubby areas, and we depaved areas to get hedging in. And just last year, we noticed birds moving through these. The bats are using they're going along the actual towpath itself. The hedges are approved of by the owners of buildings when they understand that they're also beneficial, because graffiti artists can't get behind. They don't need to continually have to clean to create a blank canvas. And then we are planting in the canal itself. Next, please. We did surveys, and although we couldn't actually change the water quality, we were adding structure, and that was increasing where we were doing the improvements compared to where we weren't. That was increasing biodiversity and abundance. This was my favourite find. So I didn't know until then that there are freshwater sponges, and these exist in the Regent's Canal, and these are parasitized by freshwater sponge flies, and there's a larvae that we found. Next, please. When we were doing this work, we started having ideas of what could be achieved. There have been plans for daylighting some of the tributaries that have been culverted to some of the tributaries to the Thames. This has been on and off. It costs vast amount. Many of these tributaries are covered by buildings and roads, and it's a huge effort. But we've got the Regent's Canal. That could be, it's got a lot of ecology in it. It could be London's equivalent to New York City's High Line. But there's a lot of stakeholders, the Canal and River Trust, who aren't so keen on improving the land, because that would mean development would be much harder. It couldn't, if you want to sell it off, it wouldn't be worth as much. Next, please. We also tried to, and we had some success in improving the local nature recovery plan. It says, I've highlighted Russell Miller, Gideon Corby, Esther Edelman and Michael Priau. Special thanks. We provided case studies. I think that was damning with the faint praise. Initially, Hackney Council didn't want to include the River Lee in the plan. The most important ecological feature of the borough. We did get that in, and we got other improvements in, and so that was important. So that was one way, having an effect on that. We did also try and change the designation of the Kingsland Basin, but that didn't work. And it was, I thought what Rosie said was really interesting. You said nobody knows what a sink is. And we realised this, and we thought everyone knows what a nature reserve is. So if we could get designation for local nature reserve, for Kingsland Basin as a local nature reserve, then maybe there'd be some sort of protection. People would think, maybe I shouldn't trash it quite as badly. But that was we weren't able to do that. Next, please. We then moved on to the Old Lee, and we surveyed this initially. So it was dominated by Japanese knotweed and Himalayan balsam. Next, please. Again, this was neglected, like Kingsland Basin and many other areas, was neglected for decades. So we cleared most of the Himalayan balsam, and we've replanted areas with ostia and marginal plants. It was fascinating. So we found different ways of planting. One of the best ways is to plant where you have protection, and natural protection is the best. You get protection from dogs and anglers who want access to the water. Next, please. We have tried to connect areas with loggeries, fairly complex and protected loggeries. We use signage that looks pretty crude, but what we're trying to do is not alienate the libertarian attitudes that many people have visiting the marshes, so we don't look like we're officialdom and it's just temporary. It's not a threat. we've been working in the in-channel, in the water, and in the woodland. And I just wanted to mention a few names because this work is collaborative. So Russell Miller, who has forgotten more about woodland management and bees and many other things than the rest of Hackney has ever known. Nina Hunt, Ian Phillips, Esther Aidman have been crucial for this work. So it's very collaborative. It's many more people involved as well. Next, please. So we were making a berm when we were in the water, and the effect is to try and, most of you will know this, but the sediment fills up, and you can see the berm on the left, and then the sediment also filling up on the right. And we're planting this, we've started, and the plants are going out into the water to narrow the channel a bit. On the far side happens to be the new Spitalfields development market, New Spitalfields market that is up for development. Next, please. And we've just started the third year of this work with GLA funding, and it's 28 hectares altogether that we're looking at for working on. Next, please. So we didn't manage to get protection for Kingston Basin. It is a sink, but that apparently it means little. The developers are not held to account, so they're taking down nest boxes in bird nesting season. Everyone will know that ecology consultancies are owned by the developer, by who pays them. There I managed to stop some contractors coming over the wall to pull down our ivy, just happened to be there. On the right you can see a tree, a retained tree without a tree guard. Yeah, next please. And so, as well as developers, grounds maintenance, the housing association ground maintenance, this is not to do with the development, although the scaffolding up is separate. They tore down the ivy from the wall. They don't want that. The rubbish is now collecting again. So it seems grounds maintenance at this scale, what they seem to do is they don't understand native shrubs that are deciduous. To them, they're dead. They understand cherry laurel and hebe, which they replant. So they trim away until the plant is dead, and then they can replant. This seems to be a business model. Next, please. So just as an example, when the development for cladding remediation was given, the planning officer stated in their when they gave the go-ahead for it, it said this development will not result in net loss of biodiversity. The proposal is considered acceptable in this instance. It was clearly a great deal of biodiversity loss, but then the enforcement team leader says the potential loss arising, there's nothing they could do about it. They weren't willing to step in. Next, please. It's not just the council, the Canal and River Trust. There's loads of invasive species which are coming down the Lee navigation, coming into the Old Lee. We asked that they put a boom in. After about 2 years, they did. Within 3 months, it had broken. And I was told by the head of the CRT that invasive species control was not a priority. Next, please. But there are successes. We spent a huge amount of effort trying to oppose or get some sort of lessen the impact from development along the Regent's Canal in this case. And one of the best things that I think we got was to get a condition for automatic blinds for offices that overlook the canal. So that this should help a lot for nocturnal species. And that's a precedent for other places. Next, please. And then I think this is finally going back to the Old Lee. A very large proposal has been put in, and if this goes ahead, then Hackney Marshes will suffer from a huge influx of residents and their pets. And it will render what we've been doing on the Old Lee mere decoration. However, there is a possibility if we can get if we can make it happen to I've forgotten the word, to make this okay, to reduce the impact and maybe reverse the impact. So there is some hope. I think that might be the last one. Yes, sorry if I've gone over.
That was great, thank you. It's very, very inspiring to see, you know, before and after pictures of some really successful projects. I think, you know, what you've done is pretty amazing.